I got to know Buzgalin when this city was still called Leningrad. And I was in Russia on behalf of a small Trotskyist organization. There was a sort of mission to make contact with Marxists in Russia, in the Soviet Union. So I met him because he was involved in Alternativi. And we already had some contact with Alternativi through people in Eastern Europe, in particularly Hungary. And I met him. That was the first time.
So, our second question is, what is the theoretical developments, the provisions of the post-Soviet school of critical Marxism by Buzgalin are closest to you, and what would you argue with that requires refinement and development?
The involvement I have had with Buzgalin and Kolganov began with an involvement around the critique of neoliberalism. So we were really coming at this from two different directions. He was concerned with the kind of society which is emerging from Soviet society. We were concerned with the crisis of Western capitalism and the kind of world that was emerging from the victory of imperialism. So the engagement that we had with Buzgalin and Kolganov was primarily through the work he did in organizing what we would call heterodox economists, economists who are critical of neoliberal theory. When it came to the discussion of post-Soviet theory, my wife Radhika Desai and I, the two of us through the Geopolitical Economy Research Group, organized to try, and we did produce a book of their thinking. And there was a lot of discussion to and from, because the work they did was very interesting, but how can I put it, the academic and literary style of Soviet writers or post-Soviet writers is very different from the academic style of Western writers. So we found that we were continually asking them to clarify questions where we thought Western readers would not understand what they were saying. And they didn't think it was really necessary to make this clarification because their views were very clear. They had worked on them for 30 years. And I think the best way to judge the interaction is the result, which is to read the book, and then you can see the fusion of the two cultures in this book. But then I engaged with both of them, but particularly Buzgalin, over the concept of the creatosphere, the creator sphere. And my work was on creative industries and on culture, because that was my job in the mayor's administration in London. So we became very engaged in a dialogue about creative labor and creativity.
So our next question is, how do you see the future development of Marxism in the world as a whole, in your country, and its popularity taking into account modern social problems?
Well, I'm always nervous of the word Marxism, because as Marx once said, je ne suis pas marxiste. There is a tendency towards cultism in the world of Marxism, from which I think Buzgalin and Kolganov both completely free, which was one very refreshing. He did not discuss as a Marxist, he always discussed as a theoretical writer with ideas. So the first thing I have to say is I'm quite skeptical about Marxism in the sense of an organized current. The influence of Marx himself, which is to say an understanding of what Marx really said, is to me absolutely fundamental, because Marx is very misrepresented. He is misrepresented by his enemies the whole time, universally, but unfortunately he is not very well represented by many of his friends. So for me the most important thing is the study of Marx himself. And this has been for me an uphill battle, because what you have in the Soviet Union was what grew out of the experience of the Soviet Union was to identify the experience of Stalin and what followed as being the same as Marxism. So you had to escape from that and say, no, this is not Marxism. This is a practice which has its roots in history, but was not, you cannot make Marx responsible for that. For us, there is a Marxist tradition in the West. It's a strange thing, but it is cultist in the way that I described, and it makes many concessions to what I would consider to be fundamentally capitalist thinking. So the task is to rescue Marx from the Marxists, as far as I'm concerned. So we have slightly different tasks.
Can we say that now comes a distinctive moment in the trajectory of the development of the capitalism? Should we expect drastic changes in the model of in the near future?
What I think is happening now is a crisis of imperialism. And for a long time, the argument that we have been pursuing with our friends and associates in the West is that you cannot build socialism without first destroying imperialism. You cannot overcome even imperialist capitalism without destroying its source of income, which is its monopoly of the exploitation of the labor of the rest of the world. This is the very first, in my opinion, most superior definition of imperialism was the one created by M.N. Roy when he wrote the theses for the International in 1924. I think it was the 4th Congress, I'm not sure, of the Communist, and maybe it was the Congress of the Toilers of the East. But he defined imperialism essentially as the exploitation of the labor of foreign countries. And what I think has happened in imperialism is that competition for the share of the surplus value of the domestic economy has been replaced by competition for a share of the labor of workers abroad, which is much greater than you can get by exploiting your own workers, 4/5 of the world. So once you have this, you don't have to go into all the intricacies of whether Lenin was right or whether Luxembourg was right or whether Russia is imperialist because it's big, which is the way that most of the West seem to think, or China because it's even bigger, so it must be even more imperialist. It's a very superficial. What you have to ask is, do they exploit the labor of the people with whom they interact outside their own borders? And the answer is they don't. So the material basis of the Western socialist movements is that they basically cooperate with their own capitalists to exploit the labor of others abroad. That, in a nutshell, is what they do. This is the origin of social democracy. Therefore, to me, the huge turning point is the mobilization in support of the Palestinian people. This is the first time I have seen in the West since 1968, which was very formative for me, the mobilization against the Vietnam War. First time since the Vietnam War mobilization, when people, young people especially, have come out on the streets and totally opposed the imperialist adventures of their own government, what their own government is supporting. So I think this is a very big historical moment. It has its origin in the long-term decline of the advanced capitalist economies, which is produced, as Marx explained, by the falling rate of profit, which brings with it a decline in the rate of investment. So there is a systematic decline in the growth rate of the imperialist West, which has reached a crisis point. Probably the turning point was 2008, the crash, but now we have a series of financial crashes. This makes them more and more aggressive. So there was a period in which they were using the breakup of the Soviet Union, using this very aggressive unipolar approach to the world as a means of compensating for the failure of their own economies. Now what's happening is they're meeting the resistance of the peoples of the rest of the world. So I think we are at a defining moment. If the imperialist project falters or fails, then I think you maybe I'm optimistic, but I think you could see the basis for a very dramatic set of changes. And the example I often give is Portugal in 1974. You know, the defeat of Portugal.
Revolution of flowers or...
Yeah. Once an imperialist country loses a war, many things can happen. As we saw after the Russian Revolution, there was a wave of revolutionary movements. This was not just because of the influence of Russia. In fact, not even primarily. It was because people like the German Revolution happened in 1918, the so-called November Revolution, the Austrian Revolution, Hungarian Revolution. They were provoked by the crises within these countries. So whether you'll see a movement like that, I don't know. But I think there is a turning point in world history. And the influence of China, of course, is massive because it raises the possibility, which did not exist in 1917, of a peaceful transition. It becomes possible, as David Lane mentioned, to say, look, all you have to do is reorient towards a different trading system. All things are possible.
So now it's time to more personal questions. So, is it possible to say that now some kind of separate social group stands out, which can become the engine of the major social transformations in the near future?
I have no idea. Hegel once said, you know, history, my friend, is grey. What's his theory? My friend is grey, but history is green. In my experience in life, every time we have said, well, there are three possibilities, and what comes along is a fourth possibility you never thought of. So the real task is not to predict in advance what's going to happen. You have to try your best to guess, but to recognize change when you see it in the form which it comes. Nobody expected, in British experience, nobody expected Jeremy Corbyn. Yes. This is the least likely eventuality that one guy is a member of a group of 13 people in Parliament would become the Labour Party head, would recruit 500,000 people to the Labour Party, would get the vote of 1/3 of the British people. Nobody could foresee that. So there's a phrase you're taught when you practice as an economist, when you're paid to be an economist: never predict anything, especially the future. But what I'm most hopeful about is young people. I think that the big change I see is the young generation of today is really responding to events in a very courageous way, in a very thoughtful way. I think that the mobilization on the streets against what's happening to the Palestinian people has been astonishing, not just because they don't just come out once, they come out every week, and people are risking their jobs, they're risking their lives,
careers.
So it's very new development of this courage that we see amongst young people. So I am very encouraged by that. Makes me feel I can relax.
Thank you. So, from your point of view, what is the potential for progressive reform of capitalism? Could we create a welfare state, maybe?
Zero. The welfare state, as I think one of the neocons once put it, was an artifact of the Cold War. And I have disagreements with many of my leftist friends who say that the Western economy after the war was saved by the welfare state. No. The welfare state was produced by the victory of the Soviet people against Nazism and the victory of the Chinese people. So a compromise was necessary. They had to allow Germany to be reconstituted instead of destroying it, which is what they wanted to do. They had to allow Japan to reconsolidate as a major advanced economy, which they did not wish to do. And they allowed South Korea to become really, a part of the imperialist country. They didn't want to do that. They had to do it because otherwise these countries would have gone communist. They had to make the welfare state for the same reason. They didn't make the welfare state because of the heroic struggles of the British people. They made that because they thought the heroic struggles of the British people would lead to a revolution if they didn't give them something. And they thought that because Nazism lost. Zhukov is credited with saying that we have saved Europe from fascism and they will never forgive us. I think the prospects of self-reform of capitalism are, if it's possible to have a probability lower than zero, I would put it like that. Cannot be done.
What is the potential for the development of the new key players of the global stage, like China, India, Russia? Should we expect the consolidation of new alliances, models of integration between large countries that would violate the current order?
It is happening. The argument that I have put, I mean, you can see it, it's underway. The question is where it will go.
I suppose it was the point of the economical congress.
Yeah, because the contradiction is that you have this anti-imperialist movement in which, in a certain sense, the leadership is China, so it has a sort of socialist leadership. But the countries in it are decisively not socialist. Russia, somewhere in between. I think it has sort of a socialist army. You know, in the sense that the military, the military economy is a planned economy, right? So it has many aspects of the way that is organized, which mean that the Russian economy is more contradictory than many people speak of. But that set aside, it's a capitalist country, okay? It's not imperialist, but it is capitalist. Whether the issue always, as the communists, the early communists said, is whether the bourgeoisie can be trusted to conclude the anti-imperialist struggle. And their argument was also always that they cannot, they vacillate. So you look at the leadership of Turkey, or for God's sake, India, you know, I wouldn't trust any of them further than I could throw them, right? They vacillate. So the mobilization of the poor working propertyless people is an essential condition to make sure that they maintain that anti-imperialist momentum. But in order to do that, then the leadership then has to make concessions to working people, which the governments of Turkey, India, with all due respect to them for standing up to America, they're not prepared to do that because they're in the grip of very powerful forces who own property and exploit workers in their own country. They're not imperialists, but they're exploiters. They don't want to let that go. This is the problem in Russia as well. So the mobilization of the working class is, and poor peasants in that, and propertyless people, toiling masses, is an essential precondition for the multipolarity to become a working reality, in my opinion. And that's a very big task. I put an argument to the Valdai Club. I put a paper which they actually published, which said the biggest mistake, in my opinion, that was made by the leadership of the communist movement in Russia was to wind up the Communist International. And that was done in 1943. What was hoped was that this would lead the imperialists to compromise and say, okay, you're not going to subvert our economies. We'll work with you. It didn't happen. They were just waiting. So now we have no international movement of the working class. This is the big tragedy. For 70 years there has been no mass international workers movement.
There was an opinion that a reform was made because working class movement in different countries became too complicated to be organized by one organization.
I think the whole project, the Third International, is very badly understood. I don't think the Third International was set up as being an organization in the sense of a party. It was not an international party. It was a coordination system for communist parties in the nations. But it was able to coordinate. It was able to organize common positions through debate, through discussion. This is what we don't have. We don't have a forum in which the communist or working class parties, I mean, I think that the PSUV in Venezuela is probably a much better organization than the Communist Party in Venezuela, which is taking some rather bad positions now that I don't agree with, right? But say mass parties of the working class need to come together and discuss, hear each other's views, each other's opinions, and work out what things they can do in common. That was what the Comintern provided for. And it's gone. and we have to recreate it.
So, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. And by the way, you have a role to play in this.
Thank you.